Chairman Teskey, this is Tamara. I'm having some challenges here with my computer reading my video, so I'm actually going to log off here really quickly and reboot my computer, and I'll be joining you guys. So feel free to go ahead and get started without me, but it should just take a couple minutes here.
Well, that sounds great. I suppose that would be the standard IT advice anyway, is try rebooting, right?
Yeah, I have a hard time with this camera when I toggle between various different virtual meeting platforms, but I'm going to give it a go here, but I'll rejoin here in just a minute.
All right, fantastic. Well, perhaps we'll get started. In the meantime, I see Lance is here, so perhaps we're all ready to go. And I don't have a script to follow this evening with our format. So Lance, I suppose that's a throw to you.
Excellent. Chair Teskey, members of the Planning Commission, thanks for taking some time to kind of circle back on what we've discussed over the last couple of workshops. I'll give a brief presentation that I have a presentation that hopefully we can stop several points along the way and check in on things. But essentially what I will try to do is present back to you what we've heard so far, and we'll try to work our way toward something more like a final recommendation from Planning Commission, at least as far as directing staff on how to draft land use components of an ordinance. And I think we also have opportunity to check in on this in early February again, if we don't get to that point tonight. But I will share my screen and where are we going? Let's see. It's usually so intuitive. Bella, I don't know that I have screen share. Oh, there we go.
You do. I made you the host, so you should be able to.
Great.
I was gonna say, I got a note that you're the host, so.
Oh, great. Well, welcome to my presentation. So
Thank you.
So as we've been discussing, really there are three primary license types that we've touched on thus far, and the others we can certainly circle back on those. But I think based on everything that we have heard from the City Council thus far, these are the ones that are really on the table. It's sales or stores, cultivation, and then products manufacturers. And I'd like to underscore that while we haven't talked in too much depth about this, all of these license types can be issued as either medical or retail, aka recreational. And that means that we can certainly get into a discussion of, do we need to think about those separately or distinctly? And happy to provide background information on that, but wanted to highlight that up front. First, let's dive into sales or stores. And I'll just briefly run through this, and then hopefully we can have a discussion on each of these. Primarily what we have heard is that the commercial zone districts are the appropriate zone districts for sales. So that's C1 and C2. And then with the general indication that downtown development authority and downtown businesses may entertain it, then B2 would also be on the table. And I think it remains that we should have a discussion about some of the mixed use zone districts. So hopefully we can touch on that. We also heard broadly that treating these uses similar to liquor sales might be a good strategy. And so hopefully we can touch on some of the mechanics of that and what that might mean. We can also touch on buffers. I've got some new maps for you. And then we can talk about a total numerical cap and what the implications of different caps might be, as well as district by district capping as another strategy. And then we can also dive into use specific standards, specifically signage and odor, but we can also talk about other concepts like hours of operation. So with those items highlighted, I would open up to a discussion really on that C1, C2, B2 zoning, and whether that's something that the Planning Commission is relatively comfortable with as their recommendation, or whether there's still some discomfort with that.
Well, I suppose I'll lead off a little bit. I think that seems like the right mix of uses for sort of basic retail use. That's where we currently have basic retail uses already authorized in our code. And a lot of this, I think, in our last conversation regarding stores, we were talking some about buffering and trying to keep distance from certain types of other land uses and then from similar land uses in the marijuana industry. And I think that probably has quite a lot of impact on this as well. But I think those, as a basic consideration, yeah, C1, C2, B2 seem to be the most appropriate existing land use categories for that use, at least from my point of view.
Chairman Teskey, this is George Gotches. I would agree with that. I would not like to see any of the mixed use zones be involved.
Hi, this is Kim. I would agree with Chairman Teskey and George as well. I think if we stay in the commercial and business uses, it's more appropriate. And it also, in my opinion, creates sort of a natural buffer from the rest of the residential uses. So it'll sort of regulate that buffer by itself if we stick within those commercial and business zonings.
I think based on our conversations, in previous discussions, that I'm in alignment with that on the mixed use. But for the sake of this slide, we've talked about some different corridors that we felt may not be appropriate, the gateway corridors and some of the more primary corridors. But I'm trying to look at my zoning map right here to just see the MXOC and the MXS. But if I recall, those are pretty corridor based. Is that correct, Lance? And can you maybe pull something up that shows us where those are? Because there may in fact be a few corridors or maybe not a few where it would be an appropriate use. And as an example, is North Avenue one of those spaces? And then, of course, the conversation to get down to these zones, if I'm correct in interpreting how we've discussed in the past, looking at how those are then also spread out by those bufferings that we put together, makes those zones even more palatable and potentially some of the corridors palatable if those buffers are in place as well. Is that in alignment with what you guys were thinking too?
Yeah, speaking for myself anyway, I think that's consistent, Keith, with what we've been talking about in previous workshops about this, is doing perhaps some corridor protection, some buffering, and maybe some other sorts of overlays that would sort of go, maybe not a technical overlay, but nonetheless, additional rules that might go on top of basic zoning limitations from a use table point of view. And for what it's worth, I agree with the general desire to exclude mixed use, whether that's MXOC, MXS, or just sort of straight mixed use MU, for a couple of reasons. And one is that it doesn't really seem to greatly expand the available stock of properties in the current zoning configuration, because there's just not that much zone land in that category. But I think Commissioner Gatchis has raised this before, that there is an issue about future land use map development taking place that might change the shape of what we're thinking about here for marijuana-based uses. And I think the mixed use, at least from my standpoint, has more of a future land use map effect than a current land use map effect. But I agree with Keith. We've certainly been talking about all those things.
Chair Teskey and Commissioner Ellers, I think Tamara might have some specific kind of justification for at least consideration of those MX zone districts, but I would just briefly highlight that from a future land use perspective, those MXOC and MXS zones would be potential rezone requests in many of the same future land use categories that would also be implemented by C1 and C2. What they also offer are some of the form district standards associated specifically with those MX zones that might be compatible with other city goals. Tamara, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, thank you, Lance, for that segue. And I actually have 2 points here that I want to talk about, but I'll talk about that one first. Is the MX zone districts, though certainly aren't used with a degree of yeah, they're just not frequently used. Certainly we have some MXOC, mostly I believe in the Patterson Road corridor, albeit quite limited, but did want to just throw out there that, you know, I think in a lot of ways, the MXOC or MX categories really work to further some of the design and aesthetic elements that we've heard certainly through the comp plan process about the preference and basic site design. And for example, buildings closer to the edge of the street, not big parking lots out in front. So some really basic parameters for design that may actually be desirable. And certainly I think through the comp planning process, we've heard it's desirable to look at those type of elements when we're looking at some commercial design components. So just wanted to introduce that idea to you that I guess from my perspective, just want to make sure that we're thoughtful on which ones we're precluding and for what reasons. And I would hate to discourage, for instance, someone to rezone to an MXOC when it's furthering some other community values and issues, whereby they just end up with a C1 and can kind of do a more boilerplate type of development that might not be accomplishing other components of the broader vision. So that's one piece. The other one I wanted to come back to, and we can talk about the MX more as well. But certainly I've said enough as far as wanting to just make sure I introduce the idea and concept to you all. And then the second one is just maybe thinking through a little bit on the C1 and some of the rationale for maybe not looking at the MX or MU, and please don't take this as an advocate one way or the other, but do want to just make sure that, you know, the C1 is certainly a prolific zone district around the city. It takes up a lot of our commercial zone district, but it does allow residential. And so I wanted to be really clear that it actually, though it's not called a mixed use zone district, it certainly does and frequently is used to look at multifamily residential. And I believe, Lance, correct me if they're wrong, but the new very significant apartment complex just south of the Base Rock Walmart is actually a C1 zone district. So it allows, I believe it's a range of 12 dwelling units per acre up to 24. So just wanted to make sure you guys were very aware of kind of the uses that are allowed in that. And that may then play into, I think, the conversation about the appropriateness of those zone districts. Something else, and again, I won't go through them, but we certainly can, is you may find value in actually going back and reading the purposes of the zone districts and see if they're, just by reading and understanding the purpose of the zone district, it may be helpful to understand maybe how, in your perspective, the use could or could not align with the purpose of that zone district. And maybe to the point about what's on the future land uses, I think we're trying to think about this not only on what's zoned today, but what also could be zoned in the future. So sorry, there were a couple ideas, I think kind of three big ones there, but hopefully that was additive.
Thank you, Tamara, for clarifying some of that. Well, as a point of question, if I remember Lance's presentation last time we met, the staff recommended one of the mixed use. Which one was it?
That's MXOC, Commissioner Getzos.
Okay, and what was the thinking there? What was the rationale?
Much along the lines of what Tamara just identified. Those MXOC and MXS are two of the four MX zone districts. And rather than having the kind of detailed use table like the one I'll just show for example here, you'll see MX is left blank. And if you refer then to the more detailed code section that explains what uses are allowed, it categorizes them into several categories. So examples like civic and institutional, residential, shops. These are the kind of categories. So really the MXS and the MXOC are the ones that capture a parallel set of uses, I think mostly to C1. I think C1 is really the good corollary there because it is, in essence, in function, it is a mixed use zone district. So that was the thinking.
You know,
Okay, thanks.
to speak to Tamara's comments and for awareness on C1 having residential, you know, that C1 is, as you go through the use table, all through the uses under commercial, there's only like 3 uses that are for C, that are allowed in C2 that aren't allowed in C1. And they're generally things that are, you know, are they commercial or are they light industrial? There's somewhere in between, right? Whether it be animal boarding or whether it be processing and manufacturing, but you know, alcohol beverage production is allowed. And so it sort of swings back a little bit to the conversation we had the other day that Ken had mentioned as well in regards to where are we going with this and what's our desire? Are we looking to treat this wildly different than alcohol uses and things of that nature? And if we've come to a conclusion that that's not a primary goal, to treat it differently as though it's something to be more concerned about, then the C1, you know, throughout that land use table, it really, in the industrial section of it, is really where you start to see a big difference between C1, C2. So I'm not sure that I'm sold yet that C1 isn't appropriate. I understand that it may have some residential mix in that. And yet when you consider what that neighborhood looks and feels like, I'm not sure that the introduction of a store is going to be detrimental in that regard compared to other uses. Now, of course, that comment has to be premised on, you know, some of the other spacing and limitations that we've talked about putting on there, whether it be through buffers between each other or buffers and other things that limit the ability for there to be a green light district or something like that. So that's my thoughts on the C1.
If I can pick up on that, this is Ken. Sorry, I don't have my video on, but I'm up in Basalt, just checked into some lodging here and getting ready to ski for a few days. Yeah, what I'm hearing Keith bring up again is, are we treating this differently, and are there reasons to be more restrictive than comparable, basically, you know, 21 and over type establishments, whether that be a liquor store or tobacco store or a sex shop or something like that? And I'm not for or against that. I'm just looking for clarity. And if we are looking to treat that differently, specifically, you know, what are we trying to accomplish by that? What are the parameters? I'm hearing some kind of subjective terminology like inappropriate or palatability, things like that. And I'm not really sure what those means. Those sound very subjective to me. So from my point of view, we should either treat it the same as we do alcohol, the other 21 and overs, or we should specify why we want to treat this differently.
Commissioner Scissors, I think then I might address that directly by reverting here to this excerpt from the use table, which, as we discussed last time, identifies all of the zone districts in which a liquor store could be established pending successful liquor licensing, with the zoning really not being that point of analysis that would distinguish between liquor licensing, liquor sales and any other sort of general indoor retail. but that happens really at the licensing stage. So from a zoning perspective, if kind of strictly interpreting what you're saying, then that would suggest that treating this just like liquor would result in a table much like this one for marijuana sales. But as to whether there's a rationale for treating it differently, I think that's a policy question on which, it's more of a question to the officials than to staff.
But I think we have to keep in mind, so we're comparing it to liquor, which I appreciate that, but we're also going to be further restricted by the buffers and where it's located. So it's not, I think like in people's heads, they're thinking that there's going to be as many retail pot shops as there are liquor stores, and that's not going to be the case given all of the other restrictions.
So can you help me understand that better, Kristen? I think I get what you're saying, but so the buffers and the other restrictions are separate and distinct from zoning. Is that what you're saying?
No, they will. I mean, they're going to all end up working together. But I think if you're thinking of, if we allow this same use in the same areas as liquor stores, then I think some people may take pause in knowing how many liquor stores there are in this community. But I'm saying that number will be further reduced down by the buffers and other restrictions that will be in place. So there won't be as many pot shops in these areas as there might be liquor stores due to those other restrictions. So what I'm saying is that I agree that it should be treated similar to liquor, and this use that's in front of us, I believe. So in B1 for drinking establishments, it's conditional, and in this chart in front of us, it's an allowed use. So it would be even further restricted if we treated it just as we would for a drinking establishment. Or were you saying of retail for Lance? You're on mute.
Thank you. Apologies. The distinction there would be between places of consumption versus places of take-home sale. So what you're looking at here is liquor stores on my screen, and then where you see that conditional use, that's for a bar.
But then adult entertainment is even further restricted down to C1 and C2 and I1 and I2.
So if we look at that slide that you've shown before, Lance, and that was in the PDF that Tamara sent, that looks at those potential marijuana locations that is allowed in C1, C2, B2, and MXOC zones, we start to see how those buffers truly start to create limitations as to where things can be, and maybe it even starts to fit in with the numbers discussion on each of those districts that we've got. But furthermore, I wonder if we could facilitate the conversation by being able to see that same map on if you turned a C1 off or an MXOC off, if we needed to facilitate this conversation further. I guess one thing that I'm unclear on is we've had some good discussion on this and kind of refreshing our memories on how we got here, but I'd be real interested to hear anybody's feedback on is there a concern on any of these other than the MXS or the MU, or have we kind of reached that point where we have dwindled it down? I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm not hearing where the concern is other than mixed use. Is there any other additional zones that are of concern?
So I heard Tamara express some concern about MXOC, and I kind of wonder if there could be like a special approval process for MXOC zone districts, or if, to your point, Keith, if we were able to see kind of that cloud map with the buffers built in, maybe then we could see what the impact of keeping MXOC in there is versus taking it out. But, you know, MXOC is North Avenue, it's Patterson, it's, you know, it's all of those major corridors. And I would think that those would be prime locations for a retail store.
Christian, this is George and Chairman Teskey. I'm okay with pulling MXOC out, as staff has suggested maybe. I just don't want to see all the mixed use involved.
Clarify,
George?
is there a suggestion from staff that we take MXC out? I may have heard incorrectly, and I kind of hung on to Tamara's comments that, you know, the plus and the minus there is that if we take that out, the same location could be potentially rezoned to a C1, and inherently then we lose those you know, by design controls on there. So MXOC seemed to be actually more favorable from some of those other goals that we're trying to reach there. Did I hear that correctly or incorrectly? Tamara, can you clarify?
Yeah, Commissioner Teskey, Commissioner Ellers, you did hear that correctly. That was actually, I think, more articulate summary than I offered you on the initial end, so I appreciate that. I think that's exactly the trade-off. And I think generally, in at least my view, and this doesn't speak for the rest of the staff here by any measure, is that MXOC is akin to a C1. So, but I think you get more kind of broader community benefit, frankly, with the MXOC from some of the design elements that come with that I think are preferred in a lot of cases, especially on kind of the Patterson Road and North Avenue corridors.
Lance, since MXOC is primarily Patterson and North Commercial, can you pull up that slide that shows the buffers, please? Because as I look at this, when you add those buffers, and of course, this is assuming that we do subscribe to the same buffers that Lance has put forth there. But if so, it does it certainly does a job at isolating where even within that MXOC zones, any sites would be available there. And so before we go taking anything out, maybe we can take a look at that to just see, is this really giving us heartburn, or is it actually open up a potentially a good location to spread this type of use, you know, throughout our community rather than, you know, bringing it all in.
Chair Teskey, Commissioner Ellers, I think that's a great segue, and I will go through a couple buffering maps here momentarily. Just wanted to make sure we touched on zoning first, but I think the comment is very astute that this is a toolkit that will function in an integrated way. And so it's very hard to think of each of these things as separate. So with some of those zoning questions in mind, I'll show you some of the buffering maps we've seen and then some we haven't seen, and then maybe we can turn back to the whole slate of options here. So here's our current zoning map, and I'll just draw the distinction to hold in your mind between the dark red and the light red, which dark being C2 and light red being C1. So you can get a general sense that Horizon Drive, East North Avenue, Orchard Mesa, and then portions of West 6 and 50 are C1. And then you're seeing C2 more along the business loop, and then other portions of 6 and 50 there. So this is the kind of baseline buffering map that we've discussed. So this is schools, places of worship, and parks at a range of buffers from 5 to 2,000 feet, depending on which those are. And then the C1, C2, B2, and MXOC zones that currently exist, not necessarily those that could be rezoned in the future. And then if we do that fishnetting exercise in our GIS, this is kind of a general idea of a 2,000 foot between stores buffer layered on top of that. So that's one way to approach it. Now, we can also say, what if we bump the distance between stores from 2,000 to 4,000 feet? Well, we don't affect the other buffers. So this would be the, an illustration of that result. Or we can say, let's go back to 2,000 foot buffers on our potential locations, but increase the buffers from the sensitive uses. So this is if you do 3,000 feet from any of those 3 listed sensitive uses, and then back down to 2,000 feet. So this is just more, not that this is an illustration of kind of the gamut available to us and the range of options. So, big buffers from sensitive uses, larger buffers between those uses, and then back to maybe what we have considered as some sort of baseline consideration.
So one
Go
thing
ahead.
oh, sorry,
No, go ahead.
Keith? Okay. One thing I'm saying is there's not really much of an opportunity on Patterson, short of, it looks like, the Mesa Mall area for any kind of retail stores. And I really think that might be a missed opportunity. I think Patterson is potentially a good location for some of those kinds of shops. So I don't know how you tweak that other than saying, maybe there's a separate consideration for MXOC, but I mean, with these overlays, Patterson's essentially cut off from many retail stores.
I would agree with that. And just to bring up another, community goal that we've had and how this plugs in, I'm not so sure that I agree with what I'm about to say, but I want to put it on the table in that, North Avenue has been a place that we've been trying to revitalize. And through that revitalization, it's really been also trying to get people to go down there. The traffic counts alone on North Avenue are reduced, as well as the business activity. So Patterson, on the other hand, we've already, we had that presentation from Trent and Rick a while back talking about the medians and everything else. Now, again, I'm not sure that I agree, because I think Patterson is in fact an appropriate place for some of these commercial corridors, and I have a little bit of heartburn about some of that median element there. But the data and the safety side is there, and that's a different conversation. But where it ties back into this is, it may in fact be an opportunity to reintroduce traffic that statistically these types of uses do in fact draw traffic and bring it back to a North Avenue corridor. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think Christian and Keith, your points are well taken, and I agree. It'd be nice to have something with the Patterson corridor. My thinking would be, it's better to spread them out as much as possible rather than having them clumped together. And I think the overlays that Lance just put and showed us gave us some insight into that.
The other thing that I have to say, as funny as it sounds, is Patterson seems to be a corridor that is heavy in senior living. And the data is out there that seniors are a major consumer of this product. So Patterson may in fact be a location that we need to consider a little bit more.
If I may, Chair Teske and Commissioner Ellers, I think one of the questions that may be implied in the discussion here is, to what extent do these particular tools match the goals, right? So if the goals are to permit this type of use on some specific corridors, and what I'm hearing is perhaps it's Patterson and North and elsewhere, and to prohibit it in other areas such as the airport district, certain gateways, maybe the rail district, if those are the concerns, there may be a question as to whether buffering is the best tool for that, or whether we should look at pulling back on some of the buffers, whether that's which uses are buffered from or the distance of the buffer, and perhaps look at a different set of tools, such as a district by district cap or something along those lines.
Lance, can you delve a little deeper into that for me? Because I think that's a really interesting approach. It would help me if I understood a little better what the reasoning is for each of the kind of restrictive zones. For example, the horizon, the gateway corridors. What's the rationale? It seems to me that people who are visiting here, some of them are going to be coming to visit the pot shops. So I guess I just don't understand the rationale for the various types of buffers. And then I'm also trying to understand if we're required to have certain, are there some limits on the buffers that we been asked to operate within a range of, or are we just being asked to put them wherever we think is, appropriate? And then, that sort of leads back to my first question. If we're judging appropriateness, what's the basis for that?
Chair Teske, Commissioner Ehlers, I can certainly seek to respond to a couple of elements that I think are found in your question. I'll start with the legal basis and origin of the buffering. During the period in which medical marijuana was a limited and allowed use in the state of Colorado, but recreational retail was not, there were additional rules in place related to drug-free school zones that established certain mandatory buffers between schools and medical marijuana. Now, there is, I think, still some disagreement about the exact legal interpretation on this, but as far as I understand, many municipalities have come to the conclusion that that is no longer a state requirement for there to be any buffer necessarily. I do not know of any municipality that doesn't at least have a buffer from schools, but certainly parks and places of worship are more varied. And I think that the policy question that you raise as to why, what justification for these buffers or for saying not in a particular gateway, et cetera, those are a little less objective. I think that that interpretation is kind of just in its way. The policy question remains, I think, relevant because we have heard that from community members from the working group that there are questions about perhaps image of the community, right? When you enter the community, is the first thing you see a pot shop, and to what extent does that reflect the values of the community? And that may seem like kind of a soft topic or maybe a little squishy, so to speak, but it has certainly been raised. And so that's why we're bringing it to you.
So I might be interested in, I'm 100% on board with buffering from schools in a big way. Like, I definitely think that needs to stay on the table. But I'd be curious to see what the map looks like if we only have buffering from schools, and then maybe we, look at that 4,000 or even 3,000 foot distance between shops. And then we could also add an overlay of excluding retail stores in the gateway areas of the community and get a feel for what that looks like, because I think that might open up some opportunities, but also by increasing the distance between shops from 2,000 to 3,000 or 4,000 feet, it may also limit things back down a touch as well, and maybe be kind of a middle ground here.
That may resolve minimally some of the concerns about North Avenue's availability. I think obviously Grand Junction High School and CMU would remain at play, as well as elementaries in certain areas. But Lincoln Park is evidently takes out a large swath of that area, and I think Matchett does the same up on Patterson. So certainly a good consideration.
I like Christian's idea too. I think that we ought to look at that, and I'm in agreement. I think buffering the schools. Lance, as a point of information, does that include charter schools?
That could be defined to suit, I believe. If I were to channel John Shaver, I would think that would be something that could be challenged. But I think the assumption is yes, certainly what you see here does.
We're kind of talking about the foundation of how to then move forward from here as we talk about either buffers or numbers or corridors and whatnot. I'd really like to hear, a few of us have kind of certainly chimed in. I'd really like to invite and hear from those of you that maybe haven't spoke on the buffers in particular yet, and just get some fresh perspective. Anybody's so willing.
Lance, is there anyone from the working group on this call?
No, sir.
It'd be good to hear from them, maybe.
Absolutely can facilitate that. I do think one caveat is that we do have some written materials that really represent something closer to a consensus. I mean, I do think that it represents the median, if nothing else. But I would suggest that hearing from one or two members of the working group would likely lead to either extremely disparate opinions or the illusion that there is consensus on one end, because frankly, there's a lot of.
Yeah, let me clarify. Let me clarify that. I don't want to overburden staff, and you've done a lot of work and you've got a synopsis and you've given it to us. So I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I don't want to make your job more difficult. It's just, I respect what you've given us, and that's fine.
Commissioner Gasso, certainly that's my intent, is not to save myself any time. It's really just that I think you would find a wild disparity within that group. And so if you wanted to know what the working group thought, you'd really need all 20 of them.
Well, I don't think that's to our advantage. So we'll take your synopsis, and thank you.
Andrea here. I have a couple thoughts. I mean, I could definitely hear about or understand opening the corridors for Patterson. I do feel there's a concern that we already have a lot of traffic through that corridor. And I mean, people complain about it a lot. And so I think if there's anything that we add to that corridor, it's just going to make, the issues that we have probably just worse until we obviously start working through that Patterson corridor. So I, like Christian, would love to see maybe just some different scenarios on the map to see what that looks like. And George, I think if we're going to say schools, then I think the assumption by the public is we're going to exclude it from all schools. So charter schools and because some of those charter schools are part of District 51. So I would think that we would need to also say that would be all schools. So those are just some of my thoughts as I'm kind of getting into this and learning about all of it. But I think there's some concerns there, but I would like to see some different buffers on the map.
Andrea, I agree with you on all the schools, that we include all of them, and they are District 51. And your points are well taken.
Well, and even the religious-based schools, I don't know if they are part of School District 51, but like the school at the Catholic Church on H Road, I would think that would be a part of it. Again, not knowing exactly what School District 51's map looks like.
Agree, Christian, agree.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think, buffering from anything that qualifies as a school really is kind of what we're all looking towards. And I would agree with, what a few of us have said already. I would like to see some other alternatives, and I liked what you offered up, Christian. It feels like when you look at the map that we were looking at with the 2,000-foot separation, that looks like an awful lot of locations to me. I mean, we also have to think about the fact that these people are going to have successful businesses and not, run each other out of business. Not that 50 people are going to run out and open a store right off the bat either, but I do like the idea of looking at, maybe the 3,000 foot and changing it to maybe just the schools in the 3,000 foot. And so we could get a glimpse of some other some other thoughts on how that might go as well.
Well, and I'd like to see them a little bit more evenly distributed. By the map that's on the screen, the River Road corridor is going to be the central location for pot shops, right? And I think that if that were to take place, if the maximum number were to be allowed on the River Road corridor under this map, it will inevitably change the fabric of that River Road community. It's going to change the dynamics by having such a large concentration. And I realize that not all of these stores are going to be built out, but it certainly lends itself to a larger concentration of stores in this area. So that's kind of why I was thinking, maybe we adjust this back here and open this up a little bit more here, and maybe that will help spread some store opportunities out throughout the community rather than having them just concentrated mostly in this one area.
I'd like to throw some pretty significant caution into the wind about this concept of spacing the stores. And the reason for that is that I wonder if there's other tools, whether it be, whether there's other tools to kind of manage that, the number of licenses we give, if it's in certain districts, any of those, not to promote either one. The concern and caution I want to throw out there is that this map and showing the stars is kind of showing a worst case scenario. It's a very efficient layout of how this buffering could be. And furthermore, a savvy business owner, which all depends on how we issue the licenses, which I know we haven't gone through yet, but I want to make sure that we're aware of how one decision impacts the others, or at least start talking about it. Because if I get the first ticket and there's these other parameters on there, I'm now maybe more inclined to eliminate the potential for competition and put my store in a particular area based on that buffer than I am on finding the best footprint there, because it's going to be more about how do I eliminate competition instead of where's the best spot for me or the most.
But shouldn't that be your prerogative as a business owner to make a smart decision to minimize competition?
Absolutely, in a fair and open market. But the choice that our leadership is making, including us, is that we're limiting potentially, and what seems to be a primary part of the conversation is that we're saying we are only going to let a certain amount of them, and that we are somehow going to choose who gets that. And it's those limitations that start to put, it starts to change the shape of the conversation. So again, there's probably a lot of ways around that, and I'd love to hear any feedback on it. But when we get into spacing it between stores, you get into a first come, first serve sort of scenario that has more opportunities and benefits than somebody else through a regulatory restriction rather than through a free process.
And I actually think spacing between stores makes more sense to me than capping by zone district. Because in a capping by zone district scenario, you could put all of your stores within, a half-mile radius of one another, all in one zone district, and max out. And I'm not sure that's what we're looking for either.
And that's a good point. So another way of addressing it, one of those other tools, could be by identifying corridors, because you did accurately point out that it's either the Highway 50 or the Riverside Parkway corridor ends up having a significant amount. And so maybe that's a corridor that we start to say, hey, you got to be more than some distance, some buffer from that corridor. And that'll start to shrink down a lot there when we're talking about this western area of town. But we better be cautious on how we do that, because the only retail commercial areas in Orchard Mesa, for example, are off of Highway 50.
Chair Teske, Commissioner Allers, I just want to highlight really briefly a few concepts just based on what you discussed there. One is about location and licensing and the timing on that. We firmly anticipate that location would need to be identified in order to apply. not afterward. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another is that we do anticipate that the city council would move to set a total cap of somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 is basically what we've been hearing. It would be a new council that makes that decision, but there would likely be an overall cap such that the buffers would not have to pull all of that weight. And then the last thing I want to highlight is, we have many tools at our disposal. And so the question is, are we using the tool that aligns with the aim? And so the aim that I'm hearing most is about spreading and limiting the number. And so the buffering from sensitive land uses is really not the tool designed for that. The tools designed for that would be buffering between businesses and then setting a district by district cap. Using the buffers from sensitive uses to reduce the number of stores is kind of just strikes me as the wrong instrument when others are available.
So Lance, are you saying 6 for the whole city?
I'm relaying that council has indicated that in their conversations as well as in the recitals for the ballot question.
I'm going to say that's in the ballot recital that there'd be 6. So I think.
Did anybody else lose, Andrew?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, maybe I broke up a bit there, but I think maybe if we're using,
Please start
we're
from
using
the
wrong
beginning.
Yeah,
Andrew.
I was mostly going to say maybe we're using the wrong tools. If city council is suggesting we're going to use an RFP process, for example, to determine 6 people, applicants who are the most qualified to approve for locations within the city, well, then that is the tool by which we can determine as a city where these uses go for the most part. And having some basic parameters then along the lines that Commissioner Scissors comments that mirror in a lot of ways alcohol sales leaves the field somewhat open for the selection of a specific location, and then the numerical control and those other issues can be essentially driven by the RFP process. And maybe we're just overthinking the buffers and those sorts of things.
That's a really good point. I wonder, I know you mentioned, Lance, that the MED, the Marijuana Enforcement Division, doesn't have buffers like the alcohol licensing process does. But I wonder if you did create a map like this that did reflect the alcohol buffering rules, what does that then look like, so that then we can start looking at numerical caps? Because that language starts to get real relatable. And what I like about it the most, considering what we've learned from other communities and how they've tried to create their own language that can sometimes either be confusing, inappropriate, a little bit too one size fits all, or worse yet, in conflict with other regulatory language that's already out there. So anytime we can reference established language, that can be a good thing. Maybe not always.
So can I just ask a clarifying question on the RFP process? Because I've never written an RFP for something like this. If I am an entrepreneur and I'm interested in applying to have a retail store, would I have to own the property before I could begin that application? Or could I do it on a speculative nature and put the application in and then pending approval, purchase the property?
Chair Teskey, Commissioner Reese, that's an excellent question. Happy to speak to other elements of the RFP process or the lottery process. But to that specific question, the answer is no. You would not necessarily have to own the property. That is a local option question. And so there are municipalities that have required that. What we have heard is that has drawbacks that you've just highlighted. I think the common and increasingly accepted way to do it is a requirement that there be a conditional lease for the property, and that no 2 applicants have conditional leases for the same property.
This is a really important element that comes into play from a land use standpoint. And Lance, Tamara, if you feel that this is a conversation for another agenda, so be it. But I really want to flesh that out and talk that out, because there are great examples. And, I mentioned it last time that Palisade is a perfect example of when you limit how many people can apply for a particular property, you end up with winners that are ultimately utilizing the leftover properties, not necessarily the best from a community or a land use perspective, but just the leftover. And then the best locations inherently, go sideways. And furthermore, you could have somebody that in an RFP situation, whether it be a point system or merit-based, let me pause. I said I'm good having that conversation when the time is right. And if now's not the right time, please, 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 can I raise the flag that when it is the right time, these are big elements that I think impact what we're looking at here from a land use and buffering thing too. So I don't know when you want to gauge that it is valid.
Chair Teske, Commissioner Ellers, that's a very important consideration. And again, this whole topic has so many elements that are all deeply interwoven. We can certainly address that at another time, but I don't know that it's strictly at hand.
Lance, I had a question. Isn't the policies on the RFP process more along the appropriateness of city council to determine that rather than us as a planning commission?
Commissioner Gatsos, Chair Teske, I would look to Tamara on that to some extent, but I would right off the bat suggest that from a departmental perspective, that is more of a licensing component that is being shepherded along by the clerk's office. And while we're taking part in that because it does tie in, I think what you're saying has a lot of merit, that it's not strictly speaking a land use concern, although it does have bearing on the decisions you make. And so it's hard, again, trying to play a hand when you don't know all the cards you're holding.
Well,
At the very
think
least, I think
Go on.
our recommendations need to raise the flag and make the awareness of, hey, the RFP process impacts our basis of thinking on how this could play out or spread out, and just be able to articulate how, from a planning perspective, that process is impactful on it. And of course, that's if everybody else here agrees with my sensitivity to the importance of knowing what that RFP is and how locations might be selected given the parameters of having a 6 license limit that seems to be the direction that we're going.
Sure. I understand, Keith. And I don't disagree with you because it does influence us, especially. But all I'm saying is jurisdiction, to me, on the RFP exact proposal would be more up to city council. But it does influence us, sure.
But knowing that there's going to be an RFP process in place, or there's likely to be an RFP process in place, makes me more inclined to see this map opened up more to allow increased flexibility and opportunity distributed more throughout the city, knowing that there's likely only to be 6 shops and that it's going to be selected through an RFP process. Certainly the qualifications of how these applications are selected aren't for us to determine, but I think knowing that that is going to be in place certainly influences our decision on land use.
I agree with Christian. I think if we know that, we should be encouraging as much flexibility as we can. I think everybody agrees about the schools, but some of the rest of the concerns maybe are less of a concern.
That's a good point. So we've talked about schools, and I'm hearing somewhat of a consensus on that. But what about churches, and what about parks? Is it our role to protect churches, for example, from a use like this, or is parks, because they're city owned and maybe some of them being more youth oriented than others. Is that our primary? I might lean that way, but what do you guys think about churches and parks?
I guess I have a question about that more than anything else. And sorry, Ken, hopefully I can get my question answered here. Are there alcohol related buffering requirements for churches and parks? I know about the schools requirements in the liquor licensing area. Are there other buffer requirements?
There's a liquor store, within a chip shot of Lincoln Park Golf Course. I can tell you that. So I doubt that there are.
How do you know that, Ken?
I've both been to the liquor store and the golf course, and I lived in that neighborhood. So it's right over by the VA, and there's an elementary school there. There's a golf course there. So it doesn't appear to be. And by my way of thinking, like, again, I think the difference between selling and consuming, I don't really see a big connection between a park and a place that marijuana products are purchased. If it was a place maybe where they were consumed and you thought there might be a lot of heavy partying and stuff going on around them, that might be a little different.
Well,
I
if I
like
may,
this. So far, two big takeaways that I'm seeing or hearing that make a lot of sense is that the foundation of our thought processes kind of come with a, gosh, I just drew a blank there, but one of them being the idea that the difference between consumption versus sales, that's big. And then as soon as I can get my thoughts together, I'll throw out the other one. But there are two major. It was regarding the RFP, right? I mean, our decision making on this as we articulate it forward when we get to that recommendation, should we land in the same place we are now? Those seem to be two big foundational pieces that might help us with the conversation going forward, that we identify, here's kind of some baselines that we started with to end up here. So I'm kind of mental notes out loud.
Can I just clarify on the liquor distance restriction? So I just pulled up the state's website and the distance regulations, and it is only limited it's 500 feet from any public or parochial school or principal campus of any college, university, or seminary. So that is the extent of the liquor license restrictions in the state.
Thank you, Tamara. That was my recollection, and sort of to Keith's point about should we be buffering from parks or churches? Well, we don't do that in the liquor regulation area, and I certainly have more comfort with the idea that we should be open about where these locations are in order to give flexibility to our RFP process to select the ideal locations, rather than trying to buffer our way into a circumstance where there are a fewer number of acceptable sites that maybe don't end up being the sites that we actually think are ideal. And if we're going to overlay an RFP on top of all of this, maybe we want more field to play with than the other way around.
And the way this is so relatable to our land use side of things is the nature of limiting the number of license to a certain number and having an RFP or some system in which you have to choose them. We're doing a CUP, and that's very it's very give and take and conditional, which again opens up and just echoes on creating more opportunities that then that process is allowed to filter. So we're not doing a use by right where it's a big blanket zoning deal and look at the map and away we go. And instead we're creating just a first initial filter and relying heavily on that selection process to be the underlying filter as well, or the more refined filter.
Well, and I can appreciate buffers from parks and churches and schools from a consumption perspective. Like if we were allowing public consumption, then totally we need to have those buffers in place there. But since we're not talking about public consumption, I really do feel like schools are our priority to buffer from, and the other two, I would suggest, could be removed entirely.
I agree.
So Chair Teske, I'm hearing a fair amount of consistency on a couple items, and then also some pretty clear calls for further information about the RFP, which we may or may not be able to provide, but we can sure try. And then on additional mapping and maybe maybe a memo comparing liquor licensing requirements and what we're considering here. I wonder then if we're in a position where maybe we should touch on some of the use specific standard questions and then roll on to some of the other license types and plan to circle around on this early next month.
I think that makes sense, Lance. I agree with you in terms of what I think we're saying as a group, and hopefully that gives you enough direction to push your project forward. If we need to keep talking to give you what you need, I'm sure we can, but if you have it, let's roll on to something else.
Thank you, Chair Teske. Oh, Tamara.
Wait, yeah, Lance, I was just hoping that you might be able to go back and summarize just so that one, we have some good notes here, but I am not sure that I heard full consistency on the zone districts, although I think I heard that regulated like retail, like liquor. So I just wanted to make sure that we captured that kind of first hurdle, and then we can build upon those. So.
Well, I can certainly take.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
I was just going to say, from my interpretation of from what I heard from the group was to have the zones mimic the use table as far as liquor sales go for liquor stores.
With the big giant flag that there is a selection process that follows this up, right? I don't mean to kick that dead horse, but man, I'm just picturing a council hearing or an open house, and if those lines aren't brought right into the fold with those, I in the past what I've seen is that a lot of people forget that piece, and all of a sudden there's anxiety built around that.
May introduce one, and maybe this is liberty here, probably a little bit too far, but did want to maybe express a little bit of concern about the B1. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention it here, but I wanted to one, just reflect on the purpose of that B1 zone district. It doesn't necessarily align with what's on the map. So I want to caveat that, but the B1 is really intended as a neighborhood business. And it says specifically that the purpose, or it is to provide small areas for office and professional services combined with limited retail uses, designed in scale with surrounding residential uses, a balance of residential and non-residential uses. So that's the purpose. And I wanted to throw this out here and introduce so it doesn't come at the 11th hour. It feels like maybe a little bit of 11th hour in this conversation here tonight, but did want to just introduce that to me when especially knowing that the likelihood of some limitations on the number of stores, that this may not align well with the purpose of the B1 zone district. So I'll stop there, but again, wanted to call that to your attention that it doesn't appear to relate particularly well to the use, especially if it's a use in fairly limited quantity.
I thought we were only talking about B2, not B1. That we were just capturing the downtown business area of B2. Did I read that slide wrong, Lance?
Well, B1 here is shown for retail, general retail sales for liquor. That's what I want.
I see. So as soon as we say follow the liquor, now all of a sudden B1 becomes an element. I gotcha. Well, on that, thank you for connecting those dots. those are good dots to connect, and I would support that as well. That B1 is probably not an appropriate one. But then again, I'm saying that based on maybe sort of feeling and opinion, and it doesn't go in alignment with what we had talked about and treating it like alcohol. So, wow,
Is-
that's
is
worth
it
talking
po-
about.
Is it possible that alcohol kind of snuck in there and maybe down the road we should look at amending that for alcohol? And obviously the places that exist would be grandfathered in, but in the future, bringing the alcohol in line with the marijuana rather than thinking of it the other way in the specific instance of B1.
So, Chairman Tuskey, Commissioner, I have a couple of thoughts on this. One is, I don't think it is necessarily out of whack in the retail sales. And, when you think about how liquor stores function, many of them are quite small. They're dropped in by their local neighborhoods. They really do serve, I think, that purpose is outlined here, and they can be a small footprint, low volume, maybe high frequency or not, type of facility. But again, thinking in terms of, and again, I think to Keith's point, limits on the number of retail facilities, I think, may create these in a different scale and size of a retail shop than kind of the neighborhood liquor store. So I don't necessarily want to open the box too wide. There may be some good approach to say, this is our bottom line here, and B1's okay because of the again, alignment and thought on its relationship to a similar use type. But again, I wanted to just introduce that so that you guys kind of have uncovered all the stones, if you will.
I got to add, as you were talking, I'm trying to look at, before we fear B1, where is B1? And as I go through this zone map, it's already pretty limited and pretty focused to where the description that you read on B1 isn't quite as applicable to the places where that zoning either exists or potentially could. So, for example, 12th and Patterson is a significant grouping of B1 between everything west of 7th Street on Patterson on the north side is B1. So it opens up a few Patterson corridors. Otherwise, there is a significant amount of B1 near Sherwood Park. So behind everything that you see on the north side of North Avenue, a block or two north before it gets into the residential, but that's going to be buffered out by the high school there. First Avenue and Orchard has some B1. I'm not going to list them all, but there's really not too many more, guys. So B1 and those areas that maybe would be more tied to residential, they're going to be buffered out by a school element anyway. So it starts to open up some of those areas that our discussion so far has said, well, hang on, why are we really limiting those out? So note taken, Tamara, but upon first look here, I'm not sure that B1 is to be feared because of its existing location, unless there's something in the future land use or comp plan that could allow places to convert to B1 that we might find undesirable.
Well, for what it's worth, I think that gives us a fair amount to go on and to maybe dig into and respond to some of those questions about the comp plan and potential future conditions. But I think this is a great step forward and facilitates us continuing to move along with this. I do want to make sure we take a moment to speak to the use-specific standards here for stores before moving along to production and cultivation. And specifically, there have been questions about signage, odor, and then I think the other one is hours of operation. So I'll just highlight some of those briefly, if that's all right. And I'll go in reverse order. So in that other category, one of the highlights is hours of operation. The state has a limit from 8 a.m. to midnight. The city of Denver further restricts that from 8 to 10. it would be a local option to restrict it further. On odor, the understanding broadly that we have gathered from other jurisdictions as well as from the working group is that this retail stores, the sales locations is really not the number one odor generator relative to the cultivation, but it can be a concern, and so that may be as simple as no perceptible odor outside and best management practices. And then I think the more challenging one is signage. We don't have John Shaver on deck to talk about exactly what we can and can't do there, but certainly other municipalities do prohibit green crosses, green leaves with an odd number of points, those types of things. Really to your discretion. So would just raise that maybe for a preliminary discussion on signage, odor, hours, and any other use specific standards that come to mind.
Well, one option would be to defer to existing language and rules that are in place. And for adult stores, there's some language, I don't know what it is, that makes sure that there's nothing inappropriate showing on that signage and whatnot. So perhaps we can pull from that, unless we want to, of course, go down the road that you mentioned of examples on signage. The odor thing, because of the items that you mentioned, seems to fit under the typical nuisance laws that we have in place and that bring things into question. And certainly anytime we're issuing a specialized license, there's likely opportunities to renew, right? And certain criteria that it hangs on to, again, much like our CUP. Under the other category, this is a tough one that, again, I'm personally conflicted by, is parking. How do we the moment you've decided to limit a number and therefore create sort of a propped up focus of demand, you inherently start to throw out a lot of the baselines that other parking laws and regulations were all designed on and built on. And we can go to other communities, and it's, I don't mean to be picking on, but the one that's most familiar is Palisade, and they have a real problem with parking. So what are some ideas or some options for addressing the parking issue? What are you going to do? Be upset or penalize a business for being successful because you've limited the number of stores that the consumers have to choose from? What do we do? Before we go down that road, maybe give an opportunity and invite others to throw out some ideas on use specific standards and just categories to add to the list before we just jump into parking as well.
So I'll piggyback. I agree that we should look at adult entertainment and bookstore types of signage. I personally would like to see signage more restrictive than not restrictive, because I do think that it can erode the perception of the image of the community. I can tell you there's a liquor establishment downtown whose signage I find extremely offensive on Main Street. And I would not like to see signage that indicates a character or animal being stoned in any way. I think that's inappropriate. So I would like to see a more restrictive, plain type of signage. And again, I agree with Keith on the odor thing. As long as it's not perceptible outside the store, then I think that's fine. But of course, that's going to be on a complaint-driven basis by the neighbors. So that'll be up to code enforcement to enforce. As for hours, I think 8 to 9, 8 to 8, 8 to 10, somewhere in there is probably appropriate. I'm not in favor of going all the way to 8 to midnight. And I do think Keith has a point in that, when you're restricting the number of facilities in the community, parking is going to become an issue, traffic's going to become an issue. So I do think we need to take some special consideration in those areas as well.
if I can speak briefly to parking in terms of the mechanics and then some other things to keep in mind. One is that it would be relatively straightforward in terms of actually the text of a code amendment. To speak to that, we can add marijuana sales as a use with a specific parking standard. And if general retail sales of this kind would typically be one per 300 square feet or one per 150 square feet, we could specify one per 100 or one per 50 or what have you. The thing to keep in mind there is that that has substantial site planning implications that are hard to summarize, but you can imagine that that is very often a make or break for any use. And retail sales already has one of the highest per square foot parking requirements. So additional parking requirements for this particular retail sale, that's challenging. And I think maybe Kim, you might be able to speak to some of the implications there on land use.
Right. I was definitely thinking along the same lines as you, Lance. We already specify the number of parking spaces, or at least a minimum requirement. So if we're thinking about, comparing this to retail sales of liquor, then, I think we could look at the retail sales of liquor parking spaces and how they're determined and what the number is, rather than calling out some, specific whole brand new process. To me, that wouldn't make any sense. I mean, I think probably the retail sales parking requirements already are just fine. And as far as the hours in the other, if you keep them broad enough, 10 to 10, 8 to 8, whatever we would determine, that also helps spread out the congestion and the parking. And so if you're open from, what if you're open from noon to 2 p.m.? Well, then you've got, you'll have a nightmare the entire time. But if we have an opening of 8 hours, 10 hours, whatever, it does spread out, the congestion. And then as far as the signage, I know we do have, restrictions already in place as far as, size and location and a lot of other things that are appropriate to what's around it and the number of cars and other things like that. And I think we could add to that a little bit and just say, we don't want them to be offensive, but we also don't want to be too detailed on that. I don't know how you kind of reel that in where we would say, exactly, we don't really want to see any green crosses or any, anything that we might find offensive or abusive, but how do you determine that? So that was kind of my thoughts on the signage, but I do think the parking could pretty much take care of itself with the same regulations as the liquor stores.
You've got a good point, because if we do require more parking, we are inherently creating a site that has more impervious surface and more parking areas that, other than this use, once it's developed, we're kind of stuck with it. And to a dramatic extent, I look at the Kmart in the parking lot on North Avenue, and now we kind of have that, and we certainly don't want to create that again inadvertently.
That's an excellent comparison, because that parking lot that has just been an eyesore for a long time, and at least now we finally have some U-Haul trucks all over. but the point of a lot of impervious surface, I mean, that would make another a nightmare. Following stormwater management controls on a huge parking lot like that would really be a nightmare too.
And I'm curious from a legal perspective, what we can actually regulate as far as signage goes. So I think some of that conversation is going to have to be deferred until we know from legal counsel what we can actually allow and disallow.
Kind of in the mix of this discussion, and I'm going to throw something out and just for thought, and it's more up to city council. But in addition to an RFP process, there's a an RQ process, a request for qualifications, that sometimes precedes an RFP process. And if I'm speaking out of line being on the planning commission, then I won't continue on. But I think a lot of the success of these of the marijuana sales shops is the people that run them, the quality. And if there's any track record, I think that might be an advantage for the community. So I think possibly city council ought to look at an R, if it's legal, John would have to say, but an RQ with the RFP process. So, and to some extent, that would take away from trying to, try to make stuff that's different, not consistent with our code, to try to regulate this. I hope everybody understood what I was trying to say.
Chair Teske, Commissioner Katsas, I really appreciate that and would highlight that when we say RFP, that's kind of a broad stand-in for a competitive process. Oftentimes, this is formulated as an RFEI, or request for expression of interest. The exact contents of that often in other jurisdictions do include exactly what you're talking about: track record, background, certainly background check. That's a state mandate. So the components of a review, and specifically the criteria, remain to be determined, but there is, I think we err on the side of having every option at our disposal in terms of what we would want to look at as a criteria.
Lance, maybe circling back to signage, I think it'd be helpful to hear from others on the commission. Commissioner Reese certainly expressed some limitations, and I would say generally things that identify, pot leaves and other types of symbols related to the sale of the marijuana product. Is that similar concern or similar limitations for the rest of commission is interested in seeing? And then certainly we can circle back with John Shaver and understand, the legal limitations and how we might author that to make sure it's defensible.
I would agree. I hate trying to put too many regulations out there on businesses. I want to definitely be careful, but I think we're all looking out to have something that's tasteful. I think Lance talked at our last meeting about that row in Trinidad or whatever, where it's just like pot shop after pot shop, which again, I know we're talking about spreading them out, but I think we just need to look at something tasteful, but balancing that we're not just, that the businesses can still have the freedom to market what they're selling. So that's kind of my thought. So I'd love to know, legally what is appropriate there.
That's really helpful, Andrea. I'm seeing heads nod. Is there any other conversation or discussion on this item? And like I said, we're happy to circle back with John on the specifics of how we might author that type of provision.
Tamara, this is George. I agree with Christian. I think the more discreet they are, the better. I would be, and I think our code deals with this, but I would definitely be not happy with digitized, big digital, digital advertising. Hey, you've come across the border now. First big city here into Colorado. So
Well, don't forget that if we elect to choose gateways and corridors and whatnot, we start to alleviate some of those concerns, which may get us comfortable with relaxing on restrictive elements based on that particular concern. Not that there aren't other concerns that may still warrant it too, but this is what's fun about this is being able to identify how these things do come together and just sort of let it start to shape itself up through the funnel that we're forcing everything down in.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to withhold any opinions until I hear the legal, but I think we just need to be real clear. Either we're inviting this into our community or we're not. So like to say, oh, let's have it, but we don't want to let them, put a green leaf up there, which is their symbol of their product, to me is inconsistent. But maybe a cross is different because that has some other implications that could be, truly offensive because it's a symbol of something else, obviously. But I just think we have to really be careful to be consistent and make decisions based on if the voters say they want this, then our policies should indicate that we are welcoming it and not treating it like it's a dirty little secret.
But I would also suggest that we have adult entertainment in our community and we don't allow them to advertise their wares on signage.
I'm not so sure about that. The one out near Mason Mall, doesn't it have like a sex neon thing of a sexy woman on it?
I don't
think it
believe
does.
so.
Huh?
I'll have to drive by and look, but I don't recall that it has anything explicit on the signage.
I think it's the silhouette of the outline of a woman. I think that's what it is.
Okay.
So
In a suggestive, it's sort of a
Yes.
sedative posture. So
yes, yes.
it's pretty to me, that's a lot
Okay,
more explicit
okay.
than a marijuana leaf. So, but like I said, something like the cross that I find that has potential to be, crossing some sort of line. But again, I think we all need to hear from Mr. Shaver, where those lines are legally.
I see Jamie turned her video on, so perhaps she's getting ready to tell us exactly what she thinks with respect to those parameters of the law. That'd be very helpful. But at least from my thought process, I think if we have an RFP or some competitive proposal process built on top of this, the more restricted, it raises a question in my mind about how restricted we need to be. Are we really talking about proposal characteristics for an RFP submittal? Hey, please tell us what you're going to do about parking. And we're trying to decide who's got the best parking plan. And someone who's proposing more parking because they're recognizing the limited number of sites that are located and they're proposing to do things to care for that. That might be one reason to select one over another. I just wonder whether we actually need code here or if what we need is RFP qualifications or categories where we're requesting proposals from the applicants about what they intend to do. Obviously, if they're intending to put up a neon sign with a intoxicated monkey on it, that might be a reason not to approve that application. And that may be the easiest way to handle that. And also from a legal compliance standpoint, that may be the more bulletproof way to handle it as well. But I'd be open, of course, and interested in counsel on those legal points.
So Jamie typed in the chat. She said she's having issues with her microphone, but she said she's happy to bring information to the commissioners regarding the signs, keeping in mind we made major changes regarding what can be included on the signs last time we changed the sign code.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah, for those that were on the planning commission at that point in time, you probably recall the suit that required content neutrality in signage. And so this is where I am not fully up to speed, certainly like John is on those exact dimensions and how they would apply here. So I think generally, unless Lance, you need some additional direction, I think we've got some good points here to explore on the signage. We can certainly bring you all back some more details as well. And from a use specific standpoint, and I lost Lance here on my screen, but there he is. I think similarly, Christian or Commissioner Reese had introduced a concept for hours of operation and wanted to hear maybe a broader discussion as well from the other commissioners on hours of operation and some of the discussion therein.
What is Palisades hours of operations right now? Or do we know any other communities?
I believe they allow it to 10 p.m.
Any feedback from the community on that, whether they'd like it later or earlier?
This is pretty unique, at least in the hearings that I've attended there, because they're very site specific. So, one of them's right there between a distillery and a brewery. and so there's less concern there. And the other one, it just sort of followed suit. So they didn't really have a whole lot of pushback, except for those that, and I think Ken put it real well, those that were more like, oh, okay, so it's here, but can we kind of keep this our dirty little secret? So otherwise it seemed to fall under that same, liquor store and alcohol sales as part of their conversation. And from my 2 cents, I think that's appropriate here as well. I don't know why we would limit it for some reason, especially since there are existing laws and regulations about consumption.
I would agree with you completely there, Keith, with, why not treat the hours the same as we do a liquor store? I mean, that just makes sense. If we're going to consider this in other areas that is similar to the retail sales of liquor, then, this is just one more added step that keeps us consistent.
I would agree. I would agree that we keep it consistent, and I'm not as concerned about the hours of operation. I could see maybe a parking situation if it was, past midnight but I think to differentiate between 10 p.m. and midnight is kind of crazy. I think that's overkill.
So my concern would be the hours of operation in the B1. I do think that the hours of operation in a B1 should have a end time that is earlier than perhaps some of the other hours in the MXOC or C1 or C2 type of zone.
I could see that, Christian. I could see that in the B1, but yeah.
Wait,
This is
doesn't
Ken.
address?
Sorry, go ahead, Keith.
Oh, so I just wanted to tip on that one. Doesn't our land use code already identify hours of operation for some items in the land use table? And does that have any relevance here that you can maybe bring to the conversation, Lance?
Yes, there are hours of operation standards for some of the zone districts. I don't know them off the top of my head and try to pull them up here.
Thanks, Keith. That was pretty much going to be my same question. It seems to me like and agreeing with Christian as well, that the issue would be you would want these stores to operate in the same time frame as other stores there, so you don't have a situation where all the different kinds of stores are closing up at 9 or 10 o'clock and this is open till midnight, if that's possible to regulate.
And Commissioner Ellers, I think you probably all are recalling a couple of fairly recent conversations for the B1. One of them was a conditional use permit for volleys that had some specific hours of operation. Those were imposed as part, I believe, of the CUP process therein and some of the representations for those business hours. But I do believe, and sorry, it's been a year now behind us, but as we looked at that drinking establishment code provision, I do believe there were previously hours of operation for those type of establishments in the B1, but those no longer, I believe, are in place. But we can certainly verify that and get back to you guys on this code specifics as well.
Thanks, Tamara. Hey, this is Ken. I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to sign out. Thank you, Lance, once again for another, excellent presentation and all the good work you're doing. And I'll look forward to our next meeting on this. Bye, everyone.
I can.
So, Chair Teske, I'd look to you for direction as to how to proceed from here. I don't know if we're going to see folks dropping like flies, or if we want to start tackling the next one or two of these, or I'll leave that to you.
Well, from a timing standpoint, we're coming on 2 hours here that we've been rolling. I think it makes sense to make as much progress as we can, of course, but want to be sensitive to the fact that we have other things going on. So what is our next thing to talk about, and how much time do you think we need for it?
Well, Chair Teske, I could do it like this. I could just show you the slides that I've got for products manufacturing and cultivation. We can try to appraise whether those are 5-minute or 5-hour conversations, and then we can make a call after that.
That sounds like a great idea.
Excellent. I'll cruise through here. So this is just to reflect back what we heard on products manufacturing, and similar to the discussion about paralleling liquor licensing. I think one of the things we heard was, well, why discriminate, so to speak, between this and any other industrial use? There are clearly nuisances such as odor that have been flagged, and that would be important to consider. And then certainly the hazardous use conditional use permit requirement would still be at play. But beyond that, I think we heard, well, I1 and I2 may be the working group recommendation, but the Planning Commission was leaning more toward treat it like a typical manufacturing or food processing, which would be the districts listed there, with the exception of those added standards for a hazardous use requiring a conditional use permit. And here you see that in its use table form. Food products and manufacturing processing are the same here when it's indoor. And just offer that for your consideration. The other license type at hand is cultivation. This is the one where we've heard the most hesitancy at a staff level, at a working group level, and at a council level. One of the things to keep in mind with this is those that see marijuana businesses as primarily an economic impact that's desirable and everything else about it is not. This is where you can hang the economic hat more so than perhaps the processing and manufacturing type uses, because for two reasons. One, we have excise tax applied to cultivation but not to products manufacturing. And then two, because the real job creator, I think, is pretty clearly the cultivation. We spoke about that a fair amount, and Keith offered some kind of anecdotal comments on that. What we've heard so far from Planning Commission is that this is an industrial use for industrial zones, that it would need to be indoor only, so no outdoor. We would probably look at a capacity requirement for any greenhouse style use. So typically you say not visible from the street. The odor being very challenging, not to over-regulate that by prescribing a specific technology, but to require best management practices broadly. And then again, in line with the municipal code, no perceptible odor. And then again, we have these conversations about, okay, do we want these uses clustered to mitigate uses? Do they need to be spread out? I think we had the egg farm conversation, right? And the idea that you cluster them, you don't. The other question is, what is one cultivation? Is that by square foot, or is that by operation? Because one 10,000 square foot cultivation and one 40,000 square foot cultivation are very different, as are one 80,000 square foot cultivation and 10,000. So that consideration is tough. And then also, are there specific industrial areas where we'd like to see this prohibited? And I would just briefly show the buffers. These are our I1 and I2. This would be that kind of generic buffer laid on there. And the comment from this group, as well as from others, has been, wow, the buffers don't seem to do much here. So with that, Chair Teske, how would you like to proceed?
Well, these sound, to me anyway, these sound like relatively easy conversations. I'll speak for myself. I think this is sort of a regurgitation in a lot of ways of what we've already said, which is what I'm expecting. So that's great. Kind of flipping back then to products manufacturing, unless we're hearing a lot of disagreement, my understanding of our last conversation was, let's treat this like other types of typical manufacturing or food processing uses. And as long as those things are happening indoors, we're generally okay with that, and perhaps not layering much more restrictions on that, certainly from a zoning standpoint. I
would
see nodding
agree.
heads, and I don't hear anybody screaming. So I
agree.
think that's I think that's a short conversation. Sort of moving on then from products manufacturing to cultivation. Somewhat similarly, I don't know that I heard a lot of hesitancy from our group about prohibiting cultivation or trying to protect industrial use areas from cultivation uses. I think the thought we were mostly having was about odor control, and the idea being that all of these uses would be subject to odor control restrictions, that there be no perceptible odor outside of the facility. I also think from a cultivation standpoint, these and products manufacturing as well, and I think I've heard this from others in this group as well, these are going to be much more difficult to identify from the exterior as well. And I think Keith has made the point in the past that indoor grow under lights and whatnot may be a thing of the past anyway. So there are lots of reasons here to think that this is maybe not as significant an issue from a land use standpoint as we may have initially thought, and perhaps we can just limit it to I1 out I2 on an indoor grow basis and go from there. But perhaps there are other thoughts here.
I wonder if I1 and I2 is too restrictive. I wonder if there would be potentially a process to allow it with a conditional use in C1 and C2. And maybe there's a good reason to not allow it in C1 and C2. So I would love to hear that side of things, but there really is not a whole lot of industrial zone land in our community. And I would like to see a little more flexibility here if that's even possible.
I would offer these two elements for consideration. That first and foremost, when we say require BMPs for odor, that's great. No perceptible odor or moving through any decision making here under the premise that this won't be a detectable odor. Everything in my experience says that's wishful thinking. I'd love to hear if the working group, that may be the one area of consensus of reality, to say making no perceptible odor, it's just challenging. Furthermore, it's impossible to, there's no measurement for it, no metric. So I think we need to have clear heads about that. Now, the second one is because greenhouses are certainly the primary way of operating this thing, this type of industry for cultivation site anyway, you have a light emission factor. And that's where the question between the C1, C2 may come in, is that industrial zones are a little bit more used to yard lights and the different elements like that at night for safety and otherwise. And C1, C2 would have those. Now, to open that up, and especially since this industry seems to have some similarities to coffee or brewery or distilleries in terms of having niche sort of homegrown flavors, styles, genetics, whatever the case may be. If C1, C2 were zones that we thought were something that we wanted to entertain, perhaps within those zones you could limit the size of it in order to limit those elements of light and or smell in those zones that might be in closer proximity to sensitivities than others.
Chair Teske, Commissioner Ellers, I think those are great points. Certainly on the no perceptible odor challenge, there are a few industry members that assert that that's possible. Broadly speaking, I agree that it's impossible. One way that has been worded in other municipalities is whatever the odor is on the interior, some percentage of that is acceptable on the outside. And so one common way is 1/7 of the interior odor on the exterior. I don't know exactly how the mechanics of that run, but I've seen that in some ordinances. The other thing I want to comment on C1 and C2, remind ourselves that C1 has those residential components, but the number one thing to consider here, I think, is the future land use category, right? Because I1 and I2 implement industrial. C2 and certainly C1, now you're implementing commercial. And so that is not only increasing the amount, but really changing the location in the community. So I think that's, while it's, strictly looking at zoning, I see the logic there, but I would just like to flag that for your attention.
So how are we addressing on this conversation the gateways, airport, and rail district? We brought those up, but did we land on trying to really eliminate those? Because those three areas, if you go back to that map you showed with the buffering, and the comment was, yeah, these. I mean, that is the gateways, the airport, and the rail district. And that's the nature of it, of I1 and I2. So I'm not sure the sensitivities to that are very real, but how do we plug those in?
I mean, I think if they're going to be, like the large scale warehouse type buildings that I've seen in other communities, it's not going to be as predominant on these gateway corridors as you might see for a retail operation. They're just going to be, I mean, an astute person will know what it is, but most people will just see a big building and not have any idea what it is, as long as there's no direct signage on it.
Yeah, and for that matter,
I think it's generally indicative of industrial uses. I mean, how many of us drive through any industrial park and say, oh, that's a this kind and that's a this thing? No one knows what they're doing in those buildings.
Right.
They're just big nondescript buildings. That's it. And I think a grow or cultivation activity fits really well with that overall kind of inconspicuous big building use.
And furthermore, if you take the gateway side of things, well, I've got a similar offense to the wastewater treatment plant in that area. If you go down to the rail district, you can chime in about the that chemical plant that's there. Now, that's not a ding on either one of those. It's just a reality of industrial, and furthermore, it's a reality of what we need as a society. I mean, those products are legitimate. Those businesses are legitimate. And so that leaves the airport to talk about, and I'm mixed on that. That does strike me as some appropriate industrial areas there, and those properties that are available. My travels in and out of this airport, I don't see those things. Those aren't the first thing that you encounter coming and going. So I have less of a concern that's been expressed otherwise here with those. So when you look at those three things, I'm inclined to kind of strike those from your previous bullet point list, Lance, and would be curious what you guys think about that, because I don't know if we can necessarily prohibit those, and instead we use those other components, require the BMPs for odor and otherwise to mitigate those impacts of what is an industrial use.
Well, and again, we're talking about cultivation, not retail sales. So being out by the airport, You know, it's not like somebody's going to get off their plane and drive over to the pot shop and, you know, buy their pot. Like nobody's even going to know that there's cultivation happening there. Nobody knows that there's a CDI office over there. So I don't see, to Keith's point, I really don't see Gateways Airport and Rail District as areas that should be prohibited, because we're not talking about any kind of very obvious operation here.
I would definitely agree with that, Christian. I think, you know, it's keeping it in that zone where we know there's manufacturing and the industrial, and it's not obvious what all of it is, and it really isn't going to affect any of our gateways. It's not going to change the appearance of like that area by the airport. Adding one more, you know, manufacturing business in there is not going to change that appearance at all.
I mean, most people don't even know what Lightner Poma make.
Right.
Well, I guess I would just like to hear Commissioner Gatsos weigh in on the airport question, because I think he had kind of championed that previously, but otherwise I'm hearing consistency.
You're on mute, George.
The only area that I was concerned with originally, and I've changed my mind after listening to the discussion, was the odor, the perceptible odor. But other than that, I think that we need to look at, we don't, and many of the commissioners have pointed out, we don't have that much industrial areas in the city. And I think we need to, and I think Kim makes a good point. They are industrial and that's what it's for. So I would disavow my previous comments.
I agree with everything that's been said.
Well, Tamara, I think that sets us up pretty well. Do you agree?
I do. Yeah, thank you. That was actually added a lot of clarity, so appreciate the conversation.
Great. Does that take us through what you'd hope to achieve this evening, Lance? All right. Well, fantastic. That turned out to not be a 5-hour conversation. So as anticipated at the top, the stores and that sort of use is the most complicated and controversial. And I think that'll continue to occupy most of our time in thinking. The manufacturing and cultivation uses, I think, are much less obtrusive and more similar to other kinds of existing uses that are regulated well by the code already, at least from 10,000 feet. So in any event, anything else we can do this evening in our workshop, or are we done?
Chairman Teskey, I think that is a wrap for tonight. 2 full hours. I appreciate your guys' time and focus, and frankly, the discussion, it's healthy, and I think you guys all have really valuable perspectives that you've lent to this conversation, so very much appreciate that. I think our charge is going to be to try to bring back, we've got another workshop for you on the 4th of February, which is our regular workshop next Thursday. And to the degree we can, we will certainly distill, I think, and probably try to put a bow on, obviously, the industrial and the cultivation piece, and make sure that we've captured the essence of the direction provided here in tonight, as well as in your previous workshops, and then try to address those remaining elements, outstanding ones for the retail components. And it sounds like we'll be doing some mapping work, as well as probably bring Mr. Shaver along to the next one to talk some specifics. Should we feel that is needed, we may also just be able to collect that information from him directly. So we will package that up and hopefully give you guys actually some reading material in advance. And hopefully that will move us through a little bit quicker on the 4th to really deal with the meat of what still remains.
That sounds excellent, Tamara. Thanks very much to you and Lance both for your presentations and helping us through this. We appreciate all the information as always, and look forward to more on the 4th.